That's fantastic. All right, sweet. I guess we can go ahead and get started. Let me just share my screen, and then yeah, feel free to tuck in and get ready for an awesome hour of learning. All right, so let's get started. Hello, hackers, and welcome to Hack the North. Welcome to the very first of the career series of talks, Intro to Open Source. For all our first-time workshop participants, welcome to the conference. And for all of our returning ones, I hope you guys had a lot of fun at the other talks from today. I'm so excited to get to meet all of you later on. Welcome to the Gear Up, whoever you may be. I hate small talk, so we'll just get right into it. And just a little bit of a side note, online workshops, especially ones really late into the day like this one, usually have a lot of latecomers. So we're starting off pretty slowly and picking up speed closer to the middle of the workshop. And like I said before, just as a little bit of a like another side note, this is meant to be kind of informal, so feel free to chill out. If you want to, you can learn. If you don't want to, feel free to connect, ask around, make some new friends. That's what we're all here for at the end of the day. But anyways, before we get into actually learning, I just wanted to go over what we'll be talking about for about the next hour-ish, so that everybody really has a good idea of how long everything's going to last. We'll start off by talking about what open source really is, cutting through all the BS and the hype, and really digging deep into the idea of free software. I'll also talk about an equally important question, who actually cares about this stuff? Right, open source might feel like a fad, or something that was invented in California for like some really niche computer scientists. But that first section is going to discuss how it's almost the complete opposite in reality. And after you have a really great understanding of what free and open source software really is, we'll delve into what open source looks like in the real world in 2021 by taking a look at what Git, the largest version control system out there, offers us as developers. And you should note that while this isn't a Git and GitHub workshop exclusively, those two concepts are still incredibly important to the way that the open source world functions right now. And so we'll be taking a look at the high level theory behind all of it. After everyone truly understands what Git is, we'll take a really quick question break and then take a look at a real world example of what open source looks like with GitHub. I'll be explaining the contributor flow, walking us through our very own contribution, along with a sizable chunk of GitHub's features. And then after another question break, we'll wrap up with a little bit of a surprise. Right here, right now, you're going to be learning how to submit your very first pull request, all from GitHub. You're going to start your contribution journey into open source by the end of the workshop. I mean, this is exciting. This really excites me. So yeah, let's get going. Luckily for all of us, there are very, very few requirements to really understand the concepts behind becoming an amazing, world-changing open sorcerer. You literally just need a GitHub account for this talk. And it's also worth noting that there won't actually be a whole lot of coding in this talk. Open source is truly an idea that can apply to anybody, anywhere. And you don't even need to know how to code to start your contribution journey. In fact, in this workshop, the most that we'll ever be doing is creating a JSON object in an array at the very, very end for your first contribution. Anyways, you're probably wondering who's going to be guiding you through all of this today. And I guess it's time for me to say hi. You guys already know my name. I'm Rishi Kotari. I'm a sophomore at Turner Fenton Secondary School, and this is my third year at Hack the North. I'm in love with Formula One, like my hat shows. GraphQL, TypeScript, Rust, GitHub, open source, and all of those awesome technologies. And if you're interested in any of those too, feel free to hit me a DM on Discord after the talk. You can check out my username up top. I would love to meet you. And in our chat, we also have our wonderful mentors, Katya and Chelsea, who will be here to answer any questions that you might have and make some interesting conversation. Feel free to say hi to them. I've loved open source for quite a while now. GitHub's actually been one of the first places I've been able to drive real impact. And throughout the years I've spent programming, I've been able to contribute to everything from TypeScript infrastructure to Golang web servers and Rust tooling, along with a fair amount of workshops and other coursework for the Exorcism platform. You can check my GitHub and most other social media out at Rishiosaur. I have about 3,000 contributions on my GitHub and a couple hundred pull requests to go along with it. And I couldn't be more excited to share my amazing experiences with everyone here today. Now that all of that's sorted, let's get into what all of us are really here for, learning about open source. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about open source in some way, shape, or form throughout the years. But like I said before, that might feel like nothing more than just a buzzword or a fad. And open source is actually quite the opposite. It's something that's been ingrained in development for quite some time now. Google likes to develop Google likes to define it in a pretty high level way. To put it simply, open source software is just software where the source code is available for anyone to view, use, change, and then share. And that was taken directly from open source dev. But I don't know about you, and I kind of hate that definition. It's clunky, but for the purposes of this workshop, it is a pretty good summary for people that like that sort of thing. But if you're anything like me, you're going to need this to be broken down a little bit more. The actual definition of what makes a project open source is all defined in one massive specification written by the Open Source Initiative, the longest standing software organization dedicated to the development and preservation of free and open source software. But we don't have time to go through that entire document right now, so I've selected the four most important parts of that big definition of open source. In essence, open source software is fundamentally free, can be redistributed, is publicly accessible, and promotes collaboration, and has to involve some form of derivation and has to allow derivative products. That first one is the most important. Open source software isn't just free in price. It's free as in free speech, not like free beer. Just uploading a file onto GitHub or Pastebin with an associated license doesn't make it free software. Sure, it's uploading your file for free, but that doesn't make your project free and open source software in and of itself. Free software is purely made to protect users and developers' freedoms and rights. And at its core, it's about enriching the human world and experiences of everybody that uses it. I'm going to paraphrase from GNU right here. We campaign for these freedoms in open source purely because we think that everyone deserves them. With these freedoms, we the users, control the program and what it does for us. When we don't control the program, we call it a proprietary instrument. And in these cases, the developer or the original programmer of the program controls it, making it eventually an instrument of unjust power. You can think of the way that Microsoft Word or Windows or Mac OS for that matter, I don't have a preference, is packaged. Despite buying the software, you can't change it to fit your needs better. If you discover a security vulnerability for yourself, you can't fix it. The most that you can do is, open up a bug fix, right? If you find a gaping hole in the system that, renders your entire computer vulnerable to attack, you're not the one that can change your open source code to better adjust. This system isn't democratic or meritocratic. At all times, Microsoft or Apple are the ones with control over your computing access, not you, despite you being the one that actually buys their products. Free and open source software is designed specifically to protect against this hierarchy. It was created to make sure that anyone can update their code and protects the freedoms and liberties of the people that actually buy it, the users. TLDR, open source software is free, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's free in price. It means that it treats users like individual humans, not just as customers or numbers on a spreadsheet. I've been talking a lot about the freedoms that free and open source software protect, but what are they? Like I said before, the open source definition has a collection of all of these freedoms, but the three most important ones, and the ones that I've condensed them into, are the freedom to redistribute software, the freedom to modify it and eventually collaborate, and the freedom of the protection of derivative works. Let's explore that first one a little bit more in depth. The freedom to redistribute essentially means that anyone can use open source software in their own projects and redistribute it along with their own packages. In some cases, you can also rebrand and redistribute unmodified copies of the original project. Think of the way that you use, say, React, right? If you're building out a web app, right, you don't have to go out and specifically buy another copy of the React.js source code. Because of the way that their license works, they literally allow you to just have it in your npm package, and you can distribute your app as if it was your own. The next big bit is collaboration, and this is the thing that open source software is most known for. Open source software is fundamentally public. Anyone has access to the source code of the project, and they're allowed to change the original source to better fit their needs. But open source software takes this a step further from just free software and actually allows and emphasizes this aspect of collaboration. When a user modifies their own version of the source locally, they can make a request to move their changes into the original package, eventually establishing a culture of constant movement. Now, the last big part is this freedom of derivatives and the freedom of protection of derivatives, I should say. When somebody makes a change to their original source code, they're free to redistribute that modification as their own project. And this fundamental freedom creates an atmosphere of constant improvement. Branched off software can always proliferate and puts the buying power back into the user's hands. It prevents monopoly. Think of the way that Linux distributions proliferated, right? Obviously, I'm not an expert in Linux and I have no clue about the history of these things, but just for the sake of this workshop, let's say that somebody starts to use Ubuntu, right? They absolutely hate it, but they like some of the core concepts behind it. They can make a derivative of that and maybe change around some of the things that they don't like. That's how Arch came about, for instance, right? And so forth, right? And obviously, most of that was most likely wrong. If there are any Linux nerds in the chat, feel free to fill in the correct definitions. But yeah, anyways, these rights and freedoms that open source really protect are amazing and great, but how they might actually matter and how they're distinct from, just legalese might not be immediately obvious. What's the point of all of these different regulations and ideas? How do they make open source the world-changing development strategy that it really is? Well, there's a couple of really big things that are associated with that. There's software quality and how it leads to better idea generation, how open source software allows us to focus on harder problems and eventually achieve a lower total cost of ownership. The first one is incredibly important. And to really understand this idea, we can think about it in, through the lens of a scientific research paper. One person might have an initial idea for, a piece of research. They might end up writing a paper or a thesis, right? But that in and of itself is not entirely credible. That's where the peer review process comes in. You might show off your research project to somebody else, right? Have them vet it. And this idea applies to open source as well. The core idea is that when you have something, a really difficult problem, as soon as as soon as you try to solve it, the more people you have working on this incredibly difficult problem, the better the end product will be. Hard ideas can't just be solved by one person. You need the perspectives and brain power of many. This iterative process allows better end products to be achieved. Think of massive frameworks like GraphQL or React Native, right? Somebody had the initial idea, but it took a massive amount of brain power to actually let that come to life and get into fruition. Eventually, this leads to better end consumer welfare. Finally, the next big bit is how open source allows us to focus on harder problems. In the computer science world, we like to think that the easy problems have already been solved. When the base tier of complexity is already finished, we can start to move on to more difficult problems that lie above. Next.js builds on top of React, right? You can think of it kind of like the way that DeepMind built AlphaGo Zero, right? That would not exist if it wasn't for the redistribution that TensorFlow allowed, right? TensorFlow is this massive framework for Python that thousands of people have contributed to, and all that culminated into this incredibly difficult and complex algorithm that can beat out any other human player, right? And so when the open source world can solve all these base tier problems, right, of things like content management, machine learning, right, linear algebra, it allows us to spend time and spend more time progressively on problems that are much higher than this base tier of complexity. And this eventually means that there are better products being created every single day. Finally, open source software leads to a lower total cost of ownership. And this is pretty self-explanatory. When a big corporation or somebody that has their products be paid starts to use these open source frameworks, the amount of total time that they have to spend on developers, actually making out things like web frameworks, actually starts to lessen over time, right? If you use something like React, you don't have to build your own proprietary web framework. You use something like TensorFlow, you don't have to implement linear algebra from scratch. And that free software idea starts to trickle down, right? The lower total cost of ownership means that for us as consumers, we have to pay less. And for businesses that are trying to develop better products, they also have to pay less actually creating it. And open source is great for the world, but we're not here to talk about everybody else. We're here to talk about you, the person that's watching this right now, right? If you're here from YouTube Live, hi there. If you're here live and hopping, again, hello. But anyways, why should you care about open source software? It doesn't really pose, it doesn't really seem like it's super interesting, right? Giving away your product for free. The first big thing is that contributing to open source software really allows you to feel good. In general, most of the software you use around you and in your daily life stems from some form of open source software. Being able to contribute to something bigger than yourself and solve problems for a massive amounts of people instantly and just a couple clicks in, computer presses, literally, literally allowing to, or literally being allowed to change the world in nothing more than, just a couple seconds of pull requests. Um, that's a feeling unlike anything else that you will ever achieve. Open source software has a ridiculously low barrier to entry, and that's what makes it so magical. The next big bit is the fact that, it provides a community. Everybody here in this workshop right now was approved to Hack the North because of one thing and one thing only. They are a massive, massive nerd. And that is, probably the best adjective that you can use, right? GitHub is a community of 55 million people just like us, doing absolutely nothing but nerding around about their favorite programming languages. And that's it. It is social interaction at its finest. With open source, being an awesome contributor allows you to get a platform to share your ideas with people that'll actually listen intently. You literally get to change the world from your computer, right? And I don't know about you, but I think that that is completely magical. Your projects now don't have any form of limits. You can build something and it can get thousands upon thousands of stars in just one night, right? Everyone here in this call has something to offer the world. And however you put that into action, I'm sure that you'll go off and do great things. Open source software will allow you to, sort of achieve a baseline of real community and, development that pretty much nothing else in the world will allow you, right? Sure, you can maybe go off and create a startup, but that won't allow you to get the same amount of initial impact as open source will, right? Being able to publish something out to the entire world in just a couple minutes is something that is completely unique to open source software. And finally, if this interests you, the pay, right? Open source software is, usually associated with, people that do things in their free time, right? But that's kind of a myth in the 21st century. You can actually get paid quite a bit to contribute to open source. If you work for a pretty large organization that has really invested into these sorts of technologies, like Facebook or Google, you can actually get paid a pretty hefty salary to, go out and work on these massive frameworks, right? Alternatively, if you're completely adamant on being indie, you can go ahead and get sponsorships, right? But anyways, we've talked really a lot about the high level impacts and, processes surrounding open source software. But what does it actually look like? That's where things like Git comes in. We've said already that open source is fundamentally a human endeavor. And, humans are very complex. We need to be tracked. Open source software would not exist if we didn't have a whole bunch of different tracking systems. To really stay organized, we have to be able to track different versions of our code base, track contributors, track commits, track changes, track a whole bunch of different things over the entire timeline, of our project. And usually in the industry, this is done using something called version control system software. The most popular of these are called Git. You can think of Git more or less as a piece of software that will allow you to track your changes in a given project or a given folder over time. GitHub is a hosted social provider for Git that essentially brings the open to open source. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But think of Git like project management on an individual level. Let's try to deconstruct that a little bit. This is what a Git repository looks like. It is probably very abstract, but it represents all of the really base concepts that you need to know to become an amazing open sourcer, right? This is, pretty obviously, literally just a timeline of different blobs. What do those blobs mean? Well, they just represent commits. You can think of a commit more or less as a snapshot of your file structure at a single point in time. For all my Mac friends out there, you might be thinking that a commit is more like, Time Machine than anything, where, it takes a, big picture of your entire file system at that point in time. But a commit doesn't actually store your entire file. It stores the changes in between them. For instance, this commit doesn't hold files specifically. It only holds the changes between this commit and this commit. Similarly, this commit will only hold the changes between this first commit on main and the present time when that was created. And commits essentially allow you to roll back to previous versions of your project in case something goes wrong in the future. And they're also really great for establishing base points and seeing all of your different changes at a glance. You can associate different changes with different users. And yeah, they are a really core part of actually tracking versions and different ways that your files have changed over time in big repositories. A repository is pretty much just like a project or a specific folder that's been initialized with Git's project tracking tools. It is literally just a folder with Git capabilities. That's all that you need to know for the purposes of this workshop. But this isn't all that this diagram has to offer. There are a bunch of different intersecting lines and curves. What do those mean? Well, these are branches, and they represent isolated, independent lines of development. Each of them are essentially just different environments for creating commits in. They each store their own unique commit timeline, or basically just a timeline of different snapshots and changes that you've made. And while there aren't any specific differences between the two different names, they do have specific purposes that they're actually used for. Let's try to deconstruct this a little bit more, because there are two big types of branches that you should know about. The first is known as the main branch, and it's called main for a reason. You can think of this like the central point of truth. When you upload your repository onto some big hosted provider like GitHub, people are going to be looking at your main branch the most, and usually it will literally be called main. Let's say that we're building something like a web app, right? Usually, this main branch is going to be where all of our stable code is hosted. It's where we run our deploying, building, and testing scripts. And so obviously, we don't want to make any commits that might change around those things, right? Every time we make a commit, let's say that we have a script that runs a deployment thing, right? Every time we make a commit on main, we are expecting it to be as stable as possible. Every snapshot, every change, every save you made on here has to be as stable as possible. This is the one thing that you never want to break. When people first view your repository, they expect things to be working. Obviously, that's only if it actually grows, but that's a story for another time. So, TLDR, the main branch is essentially the central point of truth, and it's the one thing where all the commits that you make here, all the different changes that you commit, cannot be broken. But what happens when you do need to make these volatile changes? When you're not sure that the things that you're typing out will actually work or not. You need a safe space to be able to test out all of your different changes. And this is where the concept of the feature branch comes in. When you need to make volatile changes that might fail your test and build processes and all the different scripts that you've laid out, all of your precious pipelines and infrastructure, you need a sandbox environment to be able to test out your potentially broken commits as you go along. And you also need to make sure that everything that you do here is completely finished before moving it back into main. Again, this feature branch has absolutely nothing to do with main. You can think of it more or less like moving out all of your different commits into the mirror dimension for all my Doctor Strange fans. In essence, right over here, when we decide, hey, I want to make a feature, I want to see if this is going to work, but it's probably going to break a lot of things. I don't want to break anything on main. So I'm going to go ahead and create a fork in the timeline. I'm going to bring all my different changes back out into this new dimension called feet. And then that's where I'm going to start working. And so whatever happens in feet, all of these different changes that we've made represented by these snapshots don't actually have anything to do with main. Everything that happens in the separate dimension is on its own. And so, we've started to iterate on it. We're sure that the things that we've written, all the different snapshots that we've made are perfect. They are going strong. Everything about them is just great, right? It's working, it's building, it's testing fine. We've deployed it. We know that it works just fine. So how do we bring in all of these different changes back into the main branch? Well, for that, Git has something called the merge commit. You can think of the merge commit like bringing in different commits from branch to branch. Right over here, we created our very first fork in the timeline, and then we started making these different commits on this new branch, right? And then over here, this purple blob represents a merge commit. Essentially, what this does is it takes those three commits from feet, and then it starts to move them up the line and back into main. And essentially, it allows the last commit of feat to be back on main, right? Your feature commits can now be distributed, built and tested in the same way that main is on its own. Now, that was a lot of stuff, and I'm sure that you have all of your questions, but it's definitely worth reiterating a little bit later on. So what have we talked about so far? Well, right now we've talked about what open source software really is, why it affects the world. Then we talked about what Git and GitHub are. What are they? How do they tie into open source development? What makes it the people's tool. Then we talked about more high level Git concepts. We talked about merging, branches, commits, timelines, and all that jazz. And finally, we talked about the ethical parts of things, why you should join in. We know that open source software is amazing for the developer community, but why should you, as a person, become an open sourcerer? Now, we've answered all of those questions in the last section, but I'm sure that you have questions on your own. And so this is where we're going to take our first 2 or 3 minute break. Feel free to, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And you can go ahead and ask your questions in the chat. We'll be right here along with you. So yeah, obviously right now we're in the first chill zone, kind of. Feel free to ask any questions that you have. And yeah, Katya, Chelsea, and I will try our best to answer them. And obviously, if you want to, feel free to get up, stretch your legs a bit, and yeah. Thank you, Ayush. I am actually pretty nervous right now. Hopefully I don't show it, but yeah. What are some disadvantages to making your project open source? That is actually a very good question. For me, some of the biggest problems that I faced are actually trying to get your project out there. With startups, you automatically go into that vibe of like, I have to keep iterating. I have to, sort of work on my marketing, right? But with open source, you're kind of lulled into the state of security where you realize that, as soon as I bump this project out into the real world, it's instantly accessible to anybody, right? And so it's a little bit more difficult to get past that initial bump and sort of propel your project into the next stage of things. But, if you're talented enough at, being a good developer and actually building great projects, then that really shouldn't be an issue for you. Katya, Chelsea, what about you? That's actually a very good question, Hardik. For me, thanks, Neelima. All right. So for me, I actually started to code from a very young age, and my entrance was pretty abnormal. I actually didn't get started by like looking at courses or anything. I actually got started um, after like one of my family friends introduced me to like HTML and CSS while I was like a really bored eight-year-old at a family gathering. Um, and yeah, from there things just spiraled outwards. After a while, I started to get more and more involved in like GitHub communities, and yeah, here we are right now. Um, I guess the experience part just sort of comes with like the risk that you take, right? In general, the more risk you take on, the better the reward is. So yeah, feel free to like just make awesome projects, get them on your GitHub, and yeah, I think that's experience enough. All right, these are actually some really, really great questions. I don't think we have time to answer all of them right now. We need to get on with the workshop, but feel free to DM them to me on Discord or any of our other mentors. They'll also be answering as as I present. And yeah, feel free to keep asking along. All right, let me just share my screen again. Fantastic. All right, So we know that Git it's an incredible tool for understanding and really tracking your code as an individual, but open source is so much more than that. It's a really social endeavor. It's human at its core. GitHub takes your Git repositories as an individual and puts them online. It's essentially just hosted Git, and it has a bunch of features that mirror Git to make contributing super easy. GitHub's also kind of the standard for pretty much all workspaces. It is social coding in general, not just a great platform for open source. Like I said before, it is used in production and open source contexts the exact same way, right? So knowing how to use GitHub isn't just a skill that will translate well if you want to get started contributing into open source. If you end up getting, like a real world job, chances are you'll be using GitHub in your daily life. How are we going to, start to take a look at GitHub? Well, because Git, as an individual software product is pretty abstract and brings a lot of really cool new ideas to the table, explaining it is best done through diagrams. And on the other hand, GitHub is designed to be extremely straightforward. It's meant for everybody. And so the best way to actually illustrate GitHub specific features is literally by just exploring a real world repository. And we're not going to explore, just a regular one. The project we'll be exploring for today is really, really well known in the JavaScript community. Surprisingly, though, I'm not talking about React. I'm actually talking about Facebook's Jest. This is actually the world's most used testing engine for JavaScript and TypeScript. It literally has millions of downloads, and it was written by Facebook engineers for some of the largest projects in history. We'll be using this repository mainly as a way to get familiar with GitHub's feature set. I'll be walking you through the different files that you should know, the contributor workflow, and I'll explain that last one in the next section. But right now, just make sure to sit back and pay attention to the specific arrangement of features that I present right now. And that being said, let's hop in. No pun intended. I'll be walking everyone through this with both the slideshow and the actual repository. So feel free to head on over to https://github.com/Facebook/jest. URL's up there. And yeah, I'll be heading over. I'll be heading over to there right now. So right now, you should have this URL open on your own machine. And yeah, we'll be getting started with the exploration. I'll give you guys about like 10 seconds to get ready with that. All right, so you should have the GitHub website for Facebook's Jest repository open right now. And we'll begin by taking a look at what the Git part of GitHub looks like. In the last section, we explored all of Git's features. And now let's take a look at how GitHub uses these features and exposes them to viewers and to the public. So let's head on over to the actual repository and start taking a look at things and poking around with all the different interesting features. Right now, as soon as you get onto this homepage, feel free to head on over to this little clock time machine looking button, followed by end commits. As soon as you click on that, you're going to be greeted with an interesting screen. And this is how we're going to explore Git commits. As soon as we hit on that screen, we can see all the different commits in one brief timeline that have been made on the main branch. Jest main branch is called master, and that was the de facto until I believe little bit early last year. But yeah, right now it is probably in your best interest to stick to main as your main branch, obviously for GitHub defaults, and also just because it makes things a lot less confusing. Let's take a look at some interesting commits here. This looks cool. Let's take a look at this one. So here we can actually start to study what a commit actually looks like. Like I said before, a commit doesn't actually store files. It stores changes. It stores the specific ways that, really specific lines were either added, deleted, or modified, right? We can see over here that line 44 in the file that was known as changelog.md was created, right? We can see all the different lines that have been created in circular inequality.test, right? And so this commit essentially shows us what things have been changed for a given purpose. This purpose is usually mapped in one of the Git commits metadata properties, right? Every commit has a commit message or a commit title, however you want to call it, associated with it. And most features in Git and GitHub have this sort of functionality. In this case, we can see just at a glance that it is a fix for some form of bug. It attacks the bug in the jest runner module. And the thing that it does is it allows us to handle test failures with circular objects. Now, optionally, you can also have a signing ID along with your Git stuff. In this case, GitHub will usually always track your specific username that you push to GitHub with. In this case, we can see that Simon B, who's actually one of the core maintainers behind Git, has updated his things. But yeah, commits are not the only thing that Git has to offer. There are also branches. Let's take a look at what the different branching systems that Jest has put into place look like. In this case, they don't have too much. The only most interesting one that we can take a look at is called SQLite. So head on over to the code tab, click on that drop down, and let's head on over to SQLite. Let me just paste in that link for anybody that doesn't happen to have it right here. And yeah, so feel free to head on over to there, and we'll start explaining things from here. In this case, this is a very vivid description of how Git's version control changes over time. How the branching system comes into play. In this case, we can see that 1,014 commits ago. Right now we're on master. Master is in the present. Remember, 1,014 commits ago, somebody decided, hey, I'm going to create a feature that has something to do with SQLite. And so they created a fork in the timeline at that point, but they only ended up creating one commit, which is why this says it's one commit ahead, but 1,014 commits behind master. When you compare the two different branches, master is all the way over here, where SQLite is always over here, right? When you put them back on, it just doesn't make sense because SQLite hasn't been updated in over a year. We can see that the last commit was created on May 8th of 2019, right? Obviously, I know that we all still have trouble understanding time, but that's, I think 1.5 years ago. But yeah, anyways, branching and commits are really, really cool. But, again, they don't make the platform social. This is all just stuff that we've already learned. All the other features that GitHub's built in brings the open into open source. And now that we've crossed the line from repository management and individualism using Git, and it's a true open source land with GitHub, I want everyone to shed their identity purely as a learner and somebody in the audience of this workshop, and put themselves into the identity of a first-time open source contributor. I'm actually going to be walking everyone through the specific things that contributors look for when they first see a new repository. We are literally going to be creating our very first contribution to Jest, obviously all mock, like right here, right now, if you're exploring on your own. All of this is going to happen while I explain the features that we're looking at as we go along. So anyways, let's get started. The first of these features that GitHub provides for efficient contributor management are the files and folders that it's allowed support for. You can think of these like GitHub configuration files and files for new contributors. The four big categories are the README file, the .github file, the code of conduct and contributing files, and the license. The README is probably the most important one. It's the first thing that you should take a look at when you first see a brand new repository. This is essentially just a summary, which is larger and more detailed. And as you start to scale your project, it's essentially meant to illustrate what your project is and explain all the different big aspects of it. As your project becomes bigger and bigger, it is so mandatory. The next thing you should take a look at in your journey is the code of conduct and contributing files. These are essentially just community files, and they can explain what your contribution should be structured and the ways that you should act in the community. .github is essentially the GitHub configuration file. This holds workflows like event-triggered functions like onCommit or onPush, along with hidden templates for pull requests and issues, which we'll get to a little bit later on. And it also holds any metadata and other configuration like funding. Finally, there's the license, which, like you can see on the slide, is just legalese that augments how people can use a specific open source piece. Now, I know that I said that no one reads this, and that's a bit ironic, but frankly, it's true. A lot of people neglect to see this very, very first phase of open source development as important. people will oftentimes start to skip over the README, the code of conduct file, the contributing file, and just try to jump straight into development. But that isn't part of the regular flow of open source contributing. You want to make sure that you have a really, really great foundation on top of which you can start creating commits, and really start becoming a great big part of the community, right? This is the very first thing you should do. Looking through all these different files is, I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but it is incredibly, incredibly important if you want to become a great open sourcer in the future. Let's take a look at what these files actually look like within the context of Jest. And remember, we're going to be starting to, we're going to be starting to craft our very own contribution. So try to view it in that lens. Let's head on over to our tab. I just navigated over to releases. Sorry, that was just a bug. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at, pretend that we have never seen this repository before, is the README. You can always find the README at every stage or at every level in the folder structure by scrolling all the way down until you see this sort of cool looking, markdown file. In essence, we can see that, they have a delightful JavaScript testing headline, and just a brief summary of what makes Jest so great. And this is what I think is kind of like the perfect README. It summarizes all the great points and features of Jest, all really succinctly, and then it allows everybody to view what it is at a glance. And obviously, it has a table of contents, which is essentially just a lot of links to different content and different supplementary resources. It also allows us to see documentation, but not documentation in the context of users, right? It's documentation within the context of us as open source contributors. We can see how we might get started, using, starting to contribute to the repository, the API reference for how this entire package system is architected and so on. And so pretend that we've already read through the entire README. I would read through it a little bit more, but I think we should continue on with the workshop. So the README gives us a really great example and understanding of what this project really is. And so as soon as you feel that you know what this project does, how it can benefit people, and where you might be able to fit in, you can start to take a look at how you're supposed to act within the community. And this is all laid out in something called the code of conduct file. You can use GitHub's fuzzy search method to take a look at all of the different files at a glance. You can hit the search bar and then type in code, and go ahead and type in code of conduct. I'm going to paste this back in the chat yet again. So, feel free to head on over to that file. And this is what the code of conduct looks like. Just a disclaimer, it's fairly standard between all the different repositories in a given organization. But for the most part, it essentially just outlines what you need to do to be a good human. In general, it asks you, hey, as part of this open source agreement, we're asking you not to be a bad human when you interact with anybody within this community. If you choose to contribute to our project, you're also choosing to exemplify the values that we have, exemplify this pledge that we've made, the standards, right, the ethics. And so it's important that you know what kind of person this repository attracts. It's important to know what kind of people you're going to be dealing with, and most importantly, what kind of person and what kind of ethics you have to handle. And so after whether or not you're not exactly whether or not you're a good person, but as soon as you know how to act within this community, you can start to take a look at the next big part of it, which is how you should structure your contribution. You can go ahead and hit the fuzzy search method again, and we can take a look at the contributing file. This is essentially just a getting started guide into how to contribute to this repository. It outlines all the things that you should do beforehand, right? It already says you should read the code of conduct before doing anything we expect project participants to adhere to. And then it outlines a bunch of different instructions for what is expected of you, as you start to go through this process of, collecting issues, figuring out what you can do, making code changes, and so on. And so, after you've read through this, yada, 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 most of this is just going to be, getting started with the actual project, and so forth. And so once how to contribute, you can start to do some more optional things. Those three are the biggest files that you should know of. They outline what this project is, how you should act, and what kind of a human you have to be, along with how your project contribution should be structured. And those are mandatory in every instance. If you do not have a good grasp of how those three things are structured in every repository, you are never going to be one of the greatest or one of the great contributors over there, because they provide the foundation for pretty much everything that you can build on top of it. And so from there, we can start to take a look at some of the more miscellaneous folders. We can take a look just at a surface level of .github. Like I said before, this is essentially just GitHub configuration. It holds our funding configuration, our issue and pull request templates. And it also holds our workflows. We can see that they have a single one, which runs whenever we push branches called master to GitHub, or whenever we create a pull request. Now, I keep saying things like issues and pull requests a lot, and so let's try to study that a little bit more. We've talked about making the community great and the files that are used to configure a repository on GitHub. But again, it still doesn't feel very social. Where do we talk to more people? Where do we start to, get an idea of what we can do, what we can contribute to this community? This is where issues can come in. You can think of issues like a combination of Slack, Reddit, and Stack Overflow threads. They are literally just discussion forums where you can, chat about, different bugs, new ideas, or even report some different things, right? Anything that you want to talk about. They're meant to connect people over very specific atomic ideas. They have support for threads, right, for continued discussions. And it's also worth noting that each issue is atomic, right? Let's say that you're chatting in the comments about an issue relating to a specific bug in a specific version of Jest. You're not going to go ahead and say, hey, I'm running Mac OS, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, which has nothing to do with the conversation at hand. I say conversation because threads and issues are conversations. You would never walk up to one of your friends and literally stick your arm out in front of them, if they're chatting with another person, right? So don't do it in issues. It's just basic etiquette. And finally, issues are the main way to get in touch with maintainers. If you want to get, if you want to get in touch or even just claim an issue or a ticket, issues are the place where you can do that. Let's take a look at what issues look like. Once again, you can head back over to Facebook/Jest, and I'm going to go ahead and paste in this link yet again. So yeah, feel free to head on over. We're going to start exploring this a little bit more. Let's take a look at one that looks interesting. This one has a fair amount of discussion going along with it, and we can start to explore this a little bit more in depth. So click on the first one, and we can see over here that there's a couple of different big things going on. Every issue has its own, big title, and it also has an ID associated with it. In this case, this was created quite a while ago, 6180. That is almost 4,000 away from the current one of, I believe, 10,000. Each issue usually also has a specific category. In this case, we can see that this issue talks about a new API proposal. Every issue also has a specific markdown, a specific markdown bit about it. And this is essentially where your big writings go. When in this case, you're trying to lay out a new API where you have to talk about a bunch of different things. You have to talk about, what specifically you're going to do. And every repository has different templates for these different kinds of issues, right? The way that you write a feature proposal in this instance is going to be very different from the way that you create an issue, reporting a bug. And usually, whenever you hit new issue, you're going to be able to select from a bunch of these different templates. And so, we can scroll down and see what this discussion entails. We can see that this is very, very popular. 150 people have already, reacted to it, and there's quite a bit of discussion going along with it. Every bit of GitHub has the support for rich text. It has this specific flavor of Markdown, which is essentially just a markup language. So, let's say that we really like this issue. We think that we can contribute a lot to it. So in this case, we could probably write something like, hey, I'm blank, and I think that this is a cool issue. Okay, so don't actually do that. Don't like, we're not creating any issues or any pull requests or anything. We're not actually contributing to Jest. You're going to have your chance to create your contribution a little bit later on. But that's essentially how you would claim an issue, right? If you see a bug fix or something that you feel that you can really attack and bring some depth to, you think that you can help fix it, this is where you could claim the issue. As soon as you make this comment, a maintainer will probably get in touch with you, either in threads or through DMs, asking you, hey, you seem interesting. Are you sure that you can do this? Yada yada yada. Eventually, after you get the green light, or in some cases the red light, you're free to go and start making your changes. Speaking of changes, issues are really, really great for facilitating discussion. And now that we've selected or created an issue, how do we actually go about structuring and creating our contribution? How do we actually change code around? Well, we can't do that right now. And in this case, I'm actually just going to head back over to the code tab. We don't have ownership over this specific repository. We can only read, we can't write. Remember, the big part of GitHub is the fact that it's so open and so human, right? And obviously on the internet, you don't want to leave repositories that are as massive as this open to any form of contribution. You don't want anybody to, or any non-trusted individual to start to override changes on the main branch, right? That would be disastrous, right? Millions of people depend on this. You can't have your repository be open. And so, the reason for this is that we don't want this main branch to be changed. And if your intuition is deep, you'll know that branches are a solution to this. They help us create these volatile issues. So you might think, hey, if I'm an outside contributor, why don't I just create a branch in this repository, make my changes over there so that people know that, these are volatile, and then eventually, merge it back in. But unfortunately, branches can only be created by people that have both read and write access. Since we only have read, we can't do anything with this repository just yet. But branches actually work branches, like the core idea behind branches is actually very plausible. GitHub allows us to create a special kind of branch, and this is called a fork. Like I said before, forks are really just special kinds of branches, and they essentially give us access to write on our copy of the repository. Let's say that master is going all the way over here, and right over here, this snapshot that we're at in the present, we want to start contributing right over here. And so we're going to create a fork by clicking on the fork button, which allows us to take all the different commits from master and bring it out into our own ownership. And now we have a completely separate repository, but in essence, it is just a reference or a branch back to that main one. It gives us access to write on our copy of it and allows us to make changes to the project as if it was our own. And obviously, we can make all of our volatile changes because nothing we do here is going to matter for that really big repository. However, because forks are purely made to make these contributions really, really easy, their features are a little bit limited as well. It's not meant to be standalone. So, say you can't get issues on a fork. Let's take a look at how we might go about creating a fork in actuality. We can head on over back to the homepage or any other tab in the Jest repository. You can go ahead and click fork. If you're a part of any other GitHub organizations, you can go ahead and select the one that you best associate with and the one where you want to contribute. In this case, I want my contributions to be structured under my personal account. So I'm gonna go ahead and select mine. Also, feel free to follow me. Shameless plug. But yeah, so that's going to take a couple seconds. Forking is, it's not really that big of a process, but for something that's server side, it might take a while. So immediately we can see that, our hypothesis was correct. A fork is just a different type of branch. We see the exact same, pop-up as we saw when we switched over to the SQLite branch. And we can see that it's even with Facebook's master branch. And so now we have a place where we can make all of these different volatile commits. We have a place where nothing that we do here is actually going to change in Facebook's main. And so how do we actually go about editing these things? Well, your fork and all the different changes that you make have to conform to the issue that you selected or got picked to really change around. Let's say that the issue that we chose made us maybe add some garbage to the README. this is completely fake. Remember, nothing that we do here affects Facebook's main. So, let's say that, somebody gave us the green lights on adding, some gibberish right below the header. And so I'm going to type in some gibberish, and feel free to do so on your own fork, right? So I've typed in my gibberish, and this is where that idea of commits comes in. To make things official and essentially say to Git, hey, here's all the different changes that I made. I've saved them on my own file system. Can you track this in the form of a timeline? And then as soon as we create that commit, Git says, yeah, here are all of your different changes. These are structured properly. I'm going to go ahead and take these. Can I get a message from you? And that's what we're going to write right now. In this case, we can say this is going to be, it literally just updates README. So we can type in something like updates README, adds garbage. And that's it. As soon as you type that in, maybe you want to add an optional extended description, but that's optional for a reason. You can go ahead and commit all of your different changes, and boom, we have finally, started to contribute. We've started our contribution journey. We added our very first commit, and we can see that this is one commit ahead of Facebook's main branch. And the latest commit on our branch is from us. And this is awesome, right? We now have, changes that are actually live, right? This is super exciting. But, this isn't the end, right? I said before that you always need to have a way of merging your changes back into, the main branch. In this case, the main branch is coming from Facebook's Jest repository, not ours, right? And so because we don't have read and write access, we need a way to sort of request other people to essentially bring in our changes, right? How does that work? Well, we've made all of our different contributions based off of a certain issue, and we need to change, or we need to bring back our changes to this bigger repository. We effectively need to merge this with the big repository branch. And so since we're outside contributors, we essentially have to request somebody that does have write access to merge in our changes from our fork. In essence, we have to request them to pull our changes from our own repository into theirs. We need to create what's called a pull request. So, think of it this way. I'm, in this case, Rishi over on the right is, somebody that has a fork, and Rishi over on the left is an open source maintainer, somebody that has read and write access to the original repository. I've made some pretty cool changes on mine. I can show off, all the different changes that I made. And I'm going to say, hey, here are all my different changes. Can you, bring all of the stuff back into your own repository? And I can throw all of my different changes into, theirs in a pull request. And then the moderator or the maintainer is going to say, yeah, for sure. I'm going to go ahead and pull in your repository into ours. And so, what does this actually mean? Well, in the same sense that an issue is the discussion that happens at the very beginning of a contributions lifecycle, a pull request is the discussion that happens towards the end. You've finally made all of your different changes, and you might think that it works, but this is where the growth comes in. This is where this perspective idea comes in. When you first create a solution, it is probably not going to be the best. That just is a fact in computer science. You have to constantly iterate, right? You have to, and so the pull request system allows you to discuss with maintainers about how the specific changes that you made in your commits and in your branches, how those actually work. What architectural and design decisions did you make? You can think of this more or less as the code review stage of things, right? This is where you're going to start iterating, adding more commits into your branch, which will update the pull request as you go along. Let's take a look at how we might actually go about creating a pull request. And then obviously, if your pull request is approved, you can go ahead and merge it. But obviously, that has to be done by a maintainer. On our repository, on our fork of it, we can see that we have a button called pull request. We can literally go ahead and click that. And remember, we're not actually going to be creating anything, so don't follow through with this. But yeah, as soon as we go into this purgatory stage of comparing our different branches and our different repositories, GitHub gives us, well, rather kindly, I should say, gives us a warning saying, hey, we can't merge this in automatically, but you're going to have to discuss and review the changes in this comparison with others. We have to discuss all this stuff. You can go ahead and create pull requests. And yet again, GitHub gives us a really great warning saying, hey, this is your first time contributing. make sure to review the contributing guidelines and code of conduct. We've already done that because we are awesome open source contributors. And so, you can fill out this little bit of a form, right? This is just a template that, most big repositories will have. And that's it. Right now we have sort of covered pretty much everything about open source contributing. And right now I feel like everybody here should sort of get a pat on the back, honestly. A couple, I'd say like 45 minutes ago, you probably didn't even, know about what version control systems are. And yet here we are. You literally just crafted a contribution to one of the biggest repositories on GitHub, right? That is commendable in and of itself, right? You have, in my eyes, you've already started your open source contribution journey. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I'm sure that you guys have some questions. And let's take a look. Oh, this is very interesting. Okay. What tips would you have on networking and community building? I was actually going to do this a little bit later in the session, but I feel like it is worth it to do it right now. So there are a lot of really great open source communities out there. And like I said before, open source really gives you a platform to get your ideas out there. One of those communities that I happened on is called Hack Club. And so, usually GitHub will give you something called an explore page, right? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just for the purposes of this question right here. And yeah, like essentially the explore page gives you access to a bunch of different really cool repositories that are automatically recommended to you, as you go along. And yeah, I'll just show you what mine looks like if my computer decides to cooperate. And yep. So you can head on over to github.com/explore to get your customized sort of newsletter style thing, I guess. In essence, it'll just give you a bunch of really cool repositories that are aimed at your level of programming experience based off of what GitHub will show you, or based off of what you've done in GitHub. And it'll just give you a bunch of really, really interesting things, right? And so one day, I was browsing through it like every other good developer. And then I happened on this one thing called Hack Club/Hack Club. And that ended up being one of the best communities I've ever gotten to know. And so, if there are any high school age hackers out there or anybody listening to this, make sure to go check out Hack Club. We have a bunch of really cool people in the audience that are part of it. And yeah. Yeah, Jason's one of them. But yeah, okay, next question. What's the initial learning curve like when you start off with a new open source project? That is a really good question. Obviously, open source is difficult to get started with, but these are all the really basic things that you need to know, right? For me, the initial biggest problem was actually getting to know what Git was, what pull requests and issues were, right? How to interact with people. But the contributor workflow that we just outlined already highlights all of that. All right. Actually, I think all of these would be better answered at the very end because we're kind of cutting it short for time. So yeah, anyways, I'll answer all those questions at the very, very end. But yeah, let's head back onto the real workshop for now. I promise I'll get to them a little bit later on. All right, so screen is shared again. And yep, okay. So, so far we've learned about open source in a very general sense. We know all the different really high level theory parts of it. And we've already walked ourselves through, what making contribution looks like. Let's put that all into practice. No more stupid README changes. And we're actually going to create issues and pull requests here. Before that, though, we should probably recap. We've covered Git basics. We've covered what GitHub is, the open source files, and the effects of open source, right? All of those four major things that are associated with every project in existence. And so we also talked about the contributor workflow. And feel free to take a screenshot. I'm also going to be uploading these, the slides are in your hack pack. And obviously you can take a look at the recording, but just for your own purposes, this is something that will never change throughout your entire contribution journey. The first thing you should do is read as much as you possibly can, because this is going to give you a foundation for everything else in the repository, how you should act, what the repository's conventions are. You don't want to screw up your, making a change on the basis that, you're not acting as you should be, right? After you've read through all the really big files like code of conduct, contributing, and so on, you can go ahead and look at the issues. If there's something that really catches your eye that you think you can really contribute to, feel free to put in the comments, hey, this is me, this is who I do, or this is who I am, this is what I do. And somebody will give you a thumbs up or say something. And then after that, you can actually start implementing. You can go ahead, create your fork, and then you can either clone your Git repository to your own computer and make changes on your own editor. That's beyond the scope of this workshop, though. I've included supplementary resources in the hack pack. And once you've made all of your different contributions, feel free to make a pull request back to the main repository. After you've done that, you have to discuss and check with all the different contributors and main administrators of the repository, and then start iterating on your solution. And keep in mind, all of this is constructive. Nobody in open source is out to get you, right? Everything about this is about real social good. And so whenever you might feel like somebody's trying to attack you, try to reframe your point of view, right? If somebody is making or if somebody's asking you questions about a specific algorithm that you used, right? Make sure to really reiterate on it, because at its core, both of you should really be focused on trying to deliver the best possible end user experience to the people that actually use your service. And so what are we going to be doing right now? Well, we started to contribute to a really big repository, but we didn't actually get to do anything with it. And now it's time to actually go ahead and start growing out your contribution journey. You're going to be contributing to something, or to RishioSlore/OSS. And this is just a really quick little repository that I hooked up for the purposes of this workshop. In essence, it is just a list of profiles for everyone here. It's literally just a website that's dynamically fetches data and displays it all in a bunch of cards. For all my eggheads out there, it's built on Next.js, deployed through Vercel, and uses GitHub Actions for checks and CI/CD. And obviously the Vercel bot handles all deployment stuff. You guys will be able to see that as you start to create your pull requests. So what's your task here? Well, it is actually really simple. So I said before that this entire thing is about fetching data from a specific file, and then basically just deploying a new thing on every change. And that's essentially what it does. I'll give you the links to it a little bit later on so you can start to inspect it. But your task right now is to add yourself to the list according to the conventions laid out in the repository. That's it. You have to add yourself to the profile list. Here are all the links that you should really need to know for this. I'm going to post them in the chat because we're about to conclude this slideshow right now. So yeah, let me just head on over. All right, so I've sent the link to the GitHub in the chat. Feel free to take a look at that. The production website's also listed on there. And anyways, now we kind of have to start parting ways here. You're going to be in the driver's seat for the rest of this workshop. Obviously, Chelsea, Katya, and me are all going to be, hanging out in the hop-in for the next couple minutes. But for now, your task is purely to add your repository. Follow through with, reading through all the different files, creating the issue, making a fork, and then creating a pull request, doing all the things that we just talked about in this specific thing, right? Add yourself to the, to the big website, to the profile. And yeah, that is pretty much it. It has been an absolute pleasure to be here at Hack the North 2020 plus plus. And yeah, it's been a load of fun creating this workshop for you. Thank you guys so much for having me. And so yeah, I just wanted to end off on a pretty high note. And yeah, if you guys have any last questions, feel free to throw them at us right now. And yeah, so from now until the very end of the workshop, feel free to start adding in your different contributions into the big repository. Chelsea, you said that we had, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to address some of them. All right, let's see. So I already addressed the very first two. So the third one, any advice for somebody with a dev job who has very little experience? Honestly, if you already scored a developer job, that's already a really great sign. Clearly somebody thought that you were a really, really good person and somebody that had the potential to learn, right? Chances are you're probably just selling yourself short. But if you really feel like, you need the experience, like the greatest way is literally to use the resources that you already have. I would say that open source is probably the best place to really start generating your experience. But if you don't, like if you already have a developer job, understanding what's actually used in production over there, asking around, trying to network with higher ups and people around you is probably your best bet. On the other hand, if you don't actually have a dev job, I'd argue that open source is the best way to start getting experience. Like I said with Jamal's question, just trying to create as many projects as you can, high quality projects, putting them up onto your GitHub, racking up those contributions is probably one of the best things that you can do as a developer. Because not only does it help you to learn, it also helps the entire world, right? Think of it. Even if you don't think that your projects are highly structured, if you end up, making something that other people might use, like open source is a great way to try to get it out there. And yeah, Katya brings up a really good point. We're cutting it really short for time. I'm going to be here for the next couple minutes. If everybody has any last minute questions, but yeah, if you have any burning questions, feel free to put it in the open source channel. All right. So out of curiosity, how did you manage to learn all of this? Again, funny story, like my experience and my journey into this world has been pretty fascinating. But in general, I've mostly focused on open source resources. Like I've never really taken any big courses or anything. Mostly I just started learning things like JavaScript and TypeScript development by like studying other people's source code. I thought that, it demonstrated a lot of really good best practices. And it ended up working just fine. Obviously that's just how it worked for me. I'm sure the courses, guided tutorials, videos might work best for some other people, right? So the best way to really get started with this sort of stuff is just to, look around, see what works for you, right? What are the ethical issues and implementations of open source? Okay, I'll address the second part of that question first, implementations of open source. GitHub is not the only hosted Git provider out there. There are loads of alternatives like, GitLab, Git. GitHub just happens to be the biggest one, and it is a for-profit company. But the actual owner, well, not the owner, the co-founder, I believe, Tom Preston Warner. He is probably one of the biggest correspondents of open source that's out there. He's one of the biggest board members of Hack Club, right, which is fundamentally open source. And in essence, he believes and maintains that everything should be open source when possible, right? Obviously, because GitHub was from the very beginning just meant to be a startup or a company, right? They couldn't do that. But GitHub has provided extensive amounts of resources and funding back into the open source community, right? The only way that they really make money is by these enterprise and business stuff, right? And that's a common theme between all 21st century tech stuff, right? Even with Microsoft, right? They've started reinvesting things back into open source. And so, yeah, GitHub isn't the only implementation of open source, but it is definitely the largest. Feel free to check out gitlab.com though for another one. It is kind of like GitHub, just self-hosted. And the ethical issues of open source. The biggest thing and the biggest issue that I see with open source as is the licensing issue. A lot of like this is something that's always been a fundamental disagreement in the open source community. Are licenses ethical? Because it all actually, I should probably define what a license is first. A license is essentially just like a piece of legalese that augments the way that those freedoms are defined, right? They're usually like none of this is legal. None of this is legal advice. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but if you're interested in it, there are resources for that in the hack pack and on the law side from GitHub. But yeah, in general, there are copy left and I believe they're called. I'm losing the name. Oh yeah, copyleft and permissive licenses. Sorry, legalese was bumping out of my head. But in essence, copyleft licensing are a bit controversial because they are probably some of the strictest licenses that you can get out there. Stuff like GPL and the MPL. Essentially, they basically require anybody that redistributes your software or uses it to have their project open source, right? So let's say that React functions on the MPL license, right? Basically, anybody that uses React has to make sure that their project itself follows the open source definition. And if they don't, then Facebook can file a lawsuit for improper use of React. On the other hand, permissive licenses are more like, hey, here's my code. I don't care what you do with it, as long as you don't sue me for like copyright infringement or like improper use. I don't care what you do with it. I'm permitting you to do whatever you want. And that's actually what a lot of licenses do, right? A really popular one is the MIT license. That's what React uses, actually. And so, debate has really popped up about this in that, is copyleft licensing really ethical? Because open source is purely about, enriching the human environment. Some people will say, corporations need to, use open source products. Otherwise, the consumers aren't going to reap the benefits, right? And people that are proponents of copyleft licensing would say, no, we need to focus on developers. This is a developer first environment. We need to make sure that every project is completely open, right? And so there are a bunch of different ethical standpoints on that, but I'm not going to get into it. Do we have any other questions? All right, so obviously I'm going to be staying here for the next couple of minutes, so feel free to hit them at me. Thanks, Michael. It was a pleasure to have you. Hopefully you managed to submit a contribution to the profile repository. I see that we already have quite a bit of issues. Yeah. You can actually just leave that blank. You don't need to add a Twitter property. Yeah, I mean, completely aside from the workshop, how was everybody's day? It's nice to hear. Yeah, I mean, most of it obviously was kept up with practicing for this, but yeah, mine was pretty good as well. Um, yeah, do you guys have any cool ideas for Hack the North itself, the competition? Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, okay, fun fact, like I think I applied for it like back in November. And like I was 100% not expecting this. And then like Mo, the like awesome workshop coordinator and like lead for that, literally like sent out the emails at like 1:30 in the morning. And then as soon as I saw it at like 4 or 5, whenever I usually wake up, like I just froze for like a good 5 minutes because like I was, I don't know, I was kind of in shock. It was crazy. Oh, there's nothing wrong with that, Jason. I mean, like we have the team formation slides for a reason, right? There's some crazy cool people. And I mean, obviously, worst case scenario, also a best case scenario if you think about it. You might be able to find some interesting hack clubbers. I actually think Elizabeth is doing Hack the North as well. Yeah, I can vouch I can vouch for Jason's developer abilities. All right. So it is now 10:20. And in the interest of keeping time relatively short, again, thank you guys so much for coming. This has been a pleasure to teach, and yeah, hopefully you guys walked away with something, learning something else, something really cool. And obviously, GitHub and Git might be really great for the open source communities, but whatever you do in your daily life as a developer, you can benefit from this sort of version control system stuff, and hopefully, you can even put it to use in your Hack the North hack stuff. There's a lot of really cool supplementary documentation in the hack pack, so make sure to take a look at that as well. Yeah, that's about it for me. Thank you guys so much. Bye bye. Anytime.